Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
When we think of design, we tend to think of the things that we can see. We think in terms of aesthetics and beauty. We see architecture, furniture, clothes, or the layout of a web page. But design affects much more than the visual world. Design systems from education to infrastructure to public health and to politics all dictate the way society functions or fails to function. The invisible systems of design are what Thomas Fisher hopes to reveal in his new book, Designing Our Way to a Better World. This month on Access Minnesota, we sit down with the former dean of the University of Minnesota's College of Design and the current director of the Metropolitan Design Center to discuss his new book and how, by understanding the inner workings of design, we can begin to build better and more resilient systems to respond to a rapidly changing 21st century. Thomas Fisher is the former dean of the College of Design at the University of Minnesota. He is the current director of the Metropolitan Design Center at the U. His new book is out on the University of Minnesota Press and is titled Designing Our Way to a Better World. Professor Fisher, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Great to be here, Jim.
Much of this book was comprised of articles that you wrote for a variety of publications over the past 15 years. How did you manage to bring all of these articles together to form a cohesive theme for your book?
Well, that was kind of the challenge of doing it. I had been writing in various places, including the Huffington Post, which was probably the largest collection of articles. And I was just interested to see if it held together, if there were some bigger themes that brought all of these articles together. So the first proposal was really just all of the articles in a kind of anthology, and the publisher was not interested in that. And so then I began to weave all of the pieces together into a series of chapters to really make it into a book. So the articles were transformed quite a bit from the publications where they first appeared now into the book. But they really do hold together as a set of themes around the idea that we are all living in a world where there are many designed systems that aren't working very well. And they were created by people who didn't necessarily understand the design process. And it's really a call for us to use design thinking and design methods to rethink some of the big systems that are affecting all of us.
Your book suggests that we need to see the invisible systems of design rather than just the physical presence of design. What do most people consider to be design and the work of designers?
Well, that's a great question. And in the design community itself focuses on physical things. I mean, you hire a designer to do your website, or designers design clothing or cars or buildings. And so the design community itself is largely focused on these physical artifacts, these products and environments that we live in every day. And of course, there's still a need for that. But in the book, I likened it to the way the universe is organized. Only 5% of the universe is physical things, planets and stars. 95% of the universe is invisible to us. It's dark energy and dark matter. And I really make the claim that that's true in our lives as well, is that for all of the physical things that surround us, our houses, our cars, our clothing, whatever, there are all these enormous systems, our political system, our educational system, our economic system, our invisible infrastructure, that are affecting us just as much as our cars and our clothing do. They're just as much designed, but we don't think of them as designed. We sort of act as if they're a force of nature that we just have to suffer with. So this book was really both a call to the design community to recognize that, in fact, there's a whole vast area of work that has been largely overlooked, as well as a call out to decision makers and the general public to say that, you know, we don't have to suffer by these systems if they're not working well. I mean, if our economic system is leaving too many people behind, we can design a different system because the system was initially designed by somebody. So that's sort of the idea of the book.
Have we placed too many restrictions on designers by constraining them to creating spaces that are aesthetically pleasing?
Well, yeah, the way I look at aesthetics in design is when something works so well that you can't take anything away. So I'm much less interested in form, shape, color kinds of issues than I am that something works so well that everything there has to be there and is no more than what is necessary. And there's a kind of elegance to a design. And so that to me is what beauty consists of. But yes, I think that by thinking that design is only what you see and thinking that designers only care about aesthetics, which isn't true, we've overly constrained what the design community does, or at least what we think they do. I think in our fields, one of the big shifts has been this interest in design thinking, which is quite widely now used on the private sector side. In fact, there's a lot of research to show that design-centric companies, where design is not just of their products, but also where design thinking is going on in their boardroom, do much better than companies that don't think this way. And so design thinking as a set of methods has really emerged as an important way to create value.
Tell us about the concept of abduction and how it is central to design theory and practice.
Well, abduction sounds like a big highfalutin word, right? And of course, in science and math class in high school, we all learn about deduction and induction, right? So math works from theorems and it's very deductive. Science works empirically and it's very inductive. Well, those two words come from Aristotle, and it turns out that Aristotle himself used a third word called abductive that got translated out of his manuscripts somewhere in the Middle Ages. It was only rediscovered in the late 19th century. And really what he's talking about abduction is it's a kind of logic that goes laterally, that connects things that don't seem to be connected, but actually a creative person sees those connections. So the argument is that you need all three kinds of logic. You need science, you need math, but you need this third kind of lateral thinking where you have a hunch that something might work. I mean, actually all good science works that way. A good scientist has a hunch that, well, if I do this experiment, it might lead to an interesting result. Well, in making that assumption, they've done some abductive thinking. They've made some connection that hadn't been made before. And this is one of the great values of design thinking. It works laterally. It says, I'm going to take an analogy from, say, another industry, and I'm going to apply it here. I'm going to use a metaphor from some other place as a way to solve a problem. So it's very problem-solving oriented, but it's also very creative. And that's how I think about abduction.
Did you have a particular type of audience in mind when you put this book together?
Well, the book really had two audiences. I tried to write it without any jargon so that the general public and decision makers might be interested in it and read it. So that's one audience. I really want it to be a pleasurable read. I really think the academic community has an obligation to be what I sort of think of as public intellectuals, explain disciplinary knowledge in a way that the general public understands and can appreciate. And so that was one audience. The other audience was the design community, to say that, look, there's a lot of opportunity and responsibility we have to these invisibly designed systems that we need to take some responsibility for. We have an obligation to deal with these issues. And so those are the two audiences I wrote for.
How can designers apply design theory into our everyday life? When Access Minnesota returns, more of our conversation with Thomas Fisher on his new book, Designing Our Way to a Better World.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Back to the conversation on the importance of design with the former dean of the University of Minnesota's College of Design and the current director of the Metropolitan Design Center, Thomas Fisher. Where do we see examples of successfully designed systems?
Well, when you see a group of people who are relatively happy with the way things are working, frankly, I think the best design systems right now in our world are in successful corporations, where they've actually empowered their employees to be creative. 3M is often given as an example of a creative company that has empowered their employees to have time to pursue their own interests, make their own discoveries. And so those companies that have embraced design thinking are doing very well, and you find that they have a lot of happy employees. I think the public sector is behind on this, although we're doing work right now with the Centers for Disease Control, teaching their leadership design thinking methods, because they realize that as they respond to global health crises, they need to be more creative and more nimble in their response. So the CDC on the public sector side recognizes the value of this, and we're hoping that the success we have at the CDC will pervade other levels of government. We're also doing work with counties here in Minnesota, Hennepin. We're doing a really interesting design thinking process around adult foster care housing with Hennepin, Ramsey, Dakota, and Anoka counties. So various levels of government are starting to think about this, but they're a little bit behind the private sector.
What are some of the major consequences of poor design?
Well, when you think about a badly designed chair, it's uncomfortable. When you think of a badly designed car, it's dangerous. When you think of a badly designed building, it falls down in a big wind. I mean, so in the physical world of design, we know what bad design looks like. We have too much of that, by the way. We have too many airbags in cars that don't work well, or too many chairs that we put up with, and they're really not very comfortable. But the world of product design and of environmental design goes through a process where, in fact, we're pretty good. I mean, not many buildings fall down on people anymore, at least in the United States. Not that many cars crash because the car is faulty. Most of the crashes are because of driver error. So one of the results of going through a design process is that we work out the bugs on these products and these environments before they are widely used and a threat or a health hazard to people. We don't go through that same process in these invisible systems. So let's take our political system. There's a problem. Somebody sees the problem and they write a law and they apply it to solve that problem. Well, a designer would never do that. A designer would never put in place the first idea that they had. The design process is very iterative and very critical, self-critical. You go through many, many iterations before you would ever put something out there to address a problem. But so why in our political system are we writing laws and immediately voting them in and basically using the general public as the guinea pigs to see whether it worked or not? And then frequently a lot of these laws don't work very well. And then they write another law to deal with the unintended consequences that came from that. And we end up with a Rube Goldberg structure of policy that is really way too complicated for people.
Do we perhaps have a misdirected sense of urgency? In other words, there are some companies that only see beyond the next quarter or only see to the next quarter. They don't see beyond the next quarter. Does that short-term thinking negatively impact our ability to look at the longer-term picture?
Yes, the short-term thinking on the private sector's part is definitely a problem, because one of the ways that design thinking works is it looks at larger context, both spatial context and temporal context. So you can't design something just for the moment any more than you can judge a company by its performance this quarter. And if, for example, you have these kind of short-term views of what constitutes success on the part of a company, it may be actually heading to a cliff and might be going to go right over the cliff. So you have to think about the company long-term, and you also have to, so temporally, over time, as well as think about it in terms of, well, where do our employees live? What is the context for our company? What's the natural environment? I mean, if we're using resources, what are our obligations to not wasting water or, polluting the air that we're all breathing? And so these are questions that have to be asked. Actually, argue in the book, we used to ask these questions of ourselves. There used to be more community responsibility taken on the part of companies. In fact, that's at the very core of capitalism. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations argues that the reason capitalism will work, he envisioned it as a economic system for small-scale communities, is that you wouldn't pollute the river that you have to drink that water from, and you wouldn't oppress your employees because they're probably your neighbors. But the challenge we have now is capitalism's at a global scale, and we can pollute things halfway around the world and nobody sees it. We can have terrible work conditions halfway around the world and we can get away with it. And so the moral sentiment, as Adam Smith called it, no longer is working very well in our economic system. So a redesign of our economic system would say, how do we actually put the core moral sentiment of capitalism back in place? How do we make people feel a sense of obligation to other people and to the environment and still make a profit and still make money? I mean, nobody's against that, but we can't do it at the expense of other people and other species.
When Access Minnesota returns, we'll discuss how design is taught in schools and how we can better educate students on design principles.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now, here's more of our conversation with Thomas Fisher on his new book, Designing Our Way to a Better World. How is design currently taught in our educational system, both in the primary grades and in higher ed?
Well, design is almost not taught at all in the primary and secondary system in this country, which I think is unfortunate because, again, it's not like we want every person to become a designer, but it is important that you learn these kind of creative thinking processes. You know, one of the things that's interesting is in the primary schools, when you give creativity tests to little kids on a playground, they score uniformly very high. And around second grade, the creativity of students tends to plummet when we start to test them and grade them based on how correct they are rather than how creative they are. So that by high school, less than 10% of students rank very high on creativity tests. Now that may have been fine in a 20th century mass production, mass consumption economy where you really just had to follow orders and you had a job for life. And so we have an educational system that's out of sync with the new economy, which is an economy of creativity, of innovation, of entrepreneurship. And in the economy that we're increasingly in, our educational system is actually drumming out one of the most important characteristics that we all need, which is to be more innovative and creative. So we have got to find a way to build creativity back into our educational system. And the good news about that is humans are naturally creative. I mean, we are all born creative. All you have to do is look at little kids on a playground. And so we have to stop squashing our creativity and start encouraging that so that in the work world we can all be more creative and innovative in what we do. At the higher ed level, design is taught in colleges like the one we're sitting in right now, but it's still viewed as just a little specialty. And one of the arguments I make in the book is design thinking should be as pervasive across disciplines as mathematical thinking and analytical thinking and scientific thinking, which pervade many, many disciplines, because it's that third form of logic, that abductive logic, that needs to be as pervasive as inductive and deductive thinking and those forms of logic.
What do you think will be the biggest threats to our infrastructure moving forward in the decades ahead, and how do we need to factor in situations such as climate change?
Well, I mean, there's a section in the book on infrastructure, and the way in which I talk about it in terms of the challenges going forward are really twofold. So one is climate change, and leaving aside all the questions of what's causing it or whatever, we do know that weather events are becoming more extreme, right? So we've designed an infrastructure for 500-year floods that are becoming now every 5 years we're getting a 500-year flood. And so we have a challenge that our infrastructure doesn't have the capacity to deal with this. One of the arguments I make then is I don't think we can expand our infrastructure fast enough to deal with this, and we need to find more natural systems that can help us accommodate these extreme weather events. So for example, wetlands. We've been taking wetlands systematically out of our landscapes. Well, wetlands are just enormous sponges. And instead of going to the enormous expense of expanding all of our sewer systems, let's put the wetlands back in. Let's incentivize landowners to put these natural sponges back on their property and to handle these extreme events of rain and snow and what have you. And so that could be just a fairly simple incentive put in place in public policy that would encourage us to develop natural infrastructure and to distribute our infrastructure on lots of different properties rather than assuming it has to be the central government, it has to be a big government program that's very expensive. So a lot of this is also arguing for reducing the cost of government and distributing responsibility through incentives to lots of the general public. So that's one issue, the climate change issue. The other part of the infrastructure question is that there are a lot of technological changes that are changing the way we live, work, and move around. So we continue to build highways, for example, assuming everyone's still going to be driving cars. Well, we are right on the edge of a driverless car revolution and a mobility service revolution, which is going to dramatically change how many cars are on the road, you know, whether we'll even own cars. And yet we continue to build roads based on the old technology. So part of the other argument is to say that we need to look a little bit out ahead here and say, what kind of roads are we going to need in the future? There's a lot of talk about us being trillions of dollars behind in repairing our infrastructure. And what I argue in the book is what we should ask before we put all that money into this infrastructure is what kind of infrastructure do we need? How much of it do we need? And part of my argument is we have way too much infrastructure. In fact, we really need a lot less of it. So those are a couple of the arguments in the book.
When you look at a lot of industries, and I think of newspapers, the recording industry, now even the taxi industry with the rise of Uber, are we almost to a state of panic where we're just trying to maintain the status quo and hope we can sustain without really looking about how we need to reinvent these industries which are under extreme stress?
Yes, that's sort of the key question of our time right now, I think. And it's why I devoted a fairly sizable section of the book to the economy and the new economy. Because yes, I think we are moving into what some call a third industrial revolution. And we're moving into an economy that has shifted a lot of risk onto individuals. And we have a lot of public policies that are still based on assumptions from the old economy, like, for example, that people will have a job for life, or that they'll have employee provided health care. And we have an economy that is increasingly a gig economy. Everybody is an independent operator, independent consultant. That's good because it gives you a lot of flexibility, but it's bad because you don't have health insurance, you don't have much stability. And for example, the tensions between Uber and Lyft and the taxi industry is really highlighting that. And I think, and I have colleagues who have also been saying this, we need a new kind of conversation between government and its people. Because we have public policies that aren't working very well, both for people in the old economy who are having a hard time transitioning, and not working particularly well for people in the new economy who have embraced it, but are highly vulnerable because they don't have health insurance or they may not have any kind of employment security at all.
What are the biggest hurdles standing in the way of designing better systems?
One of the biggest hurdles to this redesign of systems is that, one, there are people who have much at stake in keeping the existing system going. And so they will do everything they can to resist change because they see it as a loss for themselves. So that's one barrier. And frequently it's people in power who have the most at stake, and so they have the ability to slow things down. It's interesting because on the private sector, where competition is more ruthless, you can't just rest on your laurels. I mean, everyone talks about Kodak as the example of the company that invented digital photography, ignored it, and now they, basically went out of business. And on the public sector side, you don't necessarily go out of business. Your community just kind of doesn't thrive, and eventually you don't do well, or your country doesn't thrive. So that's one barrier, is resistance. Another one is fear. So the people who are in a system may not know what the alternatives are, and so they fear change, and they're holding on to what they know, even though the new system may be much better for them. So one of the roles that I talk about in the book in terms of the design community is helping people visualize what the future might look like, and suggest alternative possible futures. There's many different possible futures, so that people get over their fear and recognize that we've all gone through these transitions before. We went through an industrial revolution in the 19th century, went through one in the 20th century with the assembly line process, and we're now in our third industrial revolution. We can do this, we can get past this, but we have to overcome both our resistance to change and our fear of it.
Thomas Fisher is the former Dean of the College of Design at the University of Minnesota. He is the current director of the Metropolitan Design Center at the U. He has a new book out on the University of Minnesota Press. It's titled Designing Our Way to a Better World. Professor Fisher, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thank you, Jim.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.